Hi, Warren Hills. It's Mrs. Makoski. I'm going to read to you today a book that I'm currently reading. It's called Flight of Passage, a memoir. My brother sent this to me, and the little description on the back is in the summer of 1966, Rinker and Kernahan Buck, two schoolboys from New Jersey, bought a dilapidated Piper Cub for $300, rebuilt it in their barn, and took off on the journey of a lifetime, a daring flight across the Rockies to California. They became the youngest aviators on record to fly America coast to coast, and their thirst for adventure and the simple audacity of their trip mirrored the innocence of the times. Because they couldn't afford one, they navigated all the way to California without a radio. So I just want to read you a few pages. I'm not going to read this whole thing. I found this part of their journey pretty funny. And so here is the map of their journey. You can see that they started in New Jersey, and I'm trying to do this backwards. Where I am about to read to you is they just spent the night in Arkansas and are flying through Oklahoma and into Texas. So they're on day 3 of their journey. As the day wore on, I became more physically hardened. Actually, it was the accumulation of days that helped. The night before, undressing at the Motel Chief, the name of the motel, Kern and I were both surprised by the black and blue marks on our bellies and hips. Flying the rough air of Kentucky, the constant jostling of our bodies against the seatbelts had bruised and opened up our blood capillaries. As we continued west in turbulence, the black and blue marks merged into a continuous ring around our waists, so that in bathing suits we looked like zebras with a single stripe. The bruises didn't hurt that much, except at the beginning and at the end of the day, and we found that we could relieve the pain by taking a hot shower or jumping into the motel pool. Kern didn't seem to mind his own rough air welts that much, but he was taken aback when he saw mine. He knew how much I hated flying in turbulence. As soon as we hit the first patch of bad air in Texas, he shook the controls so I could fly a while myself, and we also elected to fly shorter hops, remaining in the air for 2 hours or less. This only helped a little, but Kern's sympathetic attitude made it easier to bear the hours until the turbulence abated in the late afternoon. Nobody told us about prairie dogs either. We didn't even know what they were at first and had to ask at the next airport. We encountered our first colony about 15 minutes out of Decatur. I was navigating from the rear seat, peering through the open window for landmarks. There, off our left beam, was a rectilinear lunar landscape pocked by neatly spaced craters. Hey, Kern, what the heck is that? Kern authoritatively called back that we were now in the heart of Stearman Alley, and reminded me that we had passed a couple of large, abandoned World War II military training strips. Those craters up ahead, he said, were the remnants of an old Army Air Corps bombing range. I didn't think so. Nobody could drop bombs in neat rows like that. I had my own theory. No way, Kern, I called forward. That's an oil field up ahead. An oil field? Oh yeah, Kern, we're in Texas. Those are test bores for a big old oil field. We flew over for a look. As we came in low, hundreds of furry, Mad Hatter creatures scurried in every direction, tumbling head over butt for their holes. We scratched our heads. Minks, maybe? Or chinchillas? Yes, wild Texas chinchillas. Nah, we were in Texas. Out here, chinchillas and minks would be immense, as big as German shepherds back home. Probably they were some kind of western woodchuck. Whatever, these critters were apparently quite private and smart as heck about passing aircraft. In the few seconds it took us to cross their cratered community, the place was instantly deserted, empty as a ghost town, and everybody dove for their holes, except for a few stragglers racing in pell-mell for the prairie and some tumbleweed blowing across the edges. Nothing moved. There were dozens of those colonies across Texas, out as far as Midland where the desert begins. We learned to play them just right. If we approached downwind with the sun in front of us so the gophers weren't spooked by our engine noise or shadow, We could gradually sneak in with gentle turns and observe their habits. They were lovable little devils, scampering about and bumping into each other in furry collisions, coming out of their holes on the fly, standing upright and inquisitively peering up at us with their baby-like paws wedged against their cheeks. Wildlife observation gets quite boring, however, and it was a lot more fun to terrorize the critters. Kern developed our own prairie dog aerial assault tactics, but after a couple of colonies, I took over the controls myself and perfected the technique. Coming in with the sun behind us, we'd shut down the throttle and quietly glide in over the middle of a colony. The trick was to get about 50 prairie dogs all in one place and then inch over with the rudders so that the cub's shadow made a direct hit on the crowd. The plane's shadow was generally about 3 seconds ahead of us. As soon as it hit a big concentration of prairie dogs, they all dove at once for the nearest holes. At that instant, we firewalled the throttle to give the furballs an extra shot of adrenaline from the noise. It was better than yelling fire in a movie theater. As we passed over and looked straight down, a dozen or more of the gophers were stuck head first in each hole, serrated at the neck with a frantic circle of hind legs desperately kicking up a ring of dust. It worked every time, as good as a stun grenade. Scare the bejesus out of 50 dense-packed prairie dogs, and they'll all dive at once for the same hole. At the third or fourth colony, I remembered the Lance moonpies that we had purchased back in Oklahoma. As Easterners, we were not familiar with the moon pie, but apparently it was a popular food staple out west. Moon pies consisted of two giant saucers of chocolate cake held together like an Oreo with a caloric wad of sweet white cream in the middle. They looked filling, and we had a long flight ahead, so I bought a few and stuffed them in the baggage compartment. Now I wondered how a prairie dog colony would react to a moon pie dropped in its midst. When the next colony came up, I took out the first moon pie, unwrapped it, and resisted the temptation to try a bite, and opened up the side door. I shook the stick and took the plane from Kern. I set up a nice gentle glide toward the colony, with the sun on the tail. I figured that, with the forward momentum of the plane behind, the moon pie would hit just about where our shadow was. So I would release just as the prairie dogs all dove for cover. After we passed over, the prairie dogs would all extricate themselves from the holes, shake the kinks out of their necks, and discover that moon pie. Bombs away, and it looks like a good drop. I powered up, but not too much, so I could turn sharper in a slower plane and come back over the colony. The Texas prairie dog, I can report, definitely goes for moon pies. It was like a single bucket of slop thrown to 50 starving hogs. In one mad tangle of fur, tumbleweed bits, and trampled over young'uns, the whole darn colony declared war on itself. With all those craters around, theoretically it should have been difficult to see which one of them had been my moon pie drop zone, but in practice it was easy. There was this writhing, slithering, gyrating pyramid of mammals down there, 60 or 70 furious little beasts, scrambling over each other, clawing each other's eyes out, and snapping shiny teeth to get the prize, the moon pie at the bottom of the seismic heap. The prairie dog must be related to the lemming. As the scrummage piled higher, more gophers ran in from suburbs to jump on, just because everybody else was doing it. How many prairie dogs can fit on top of a moon pie? At least 100. There was one big old dominant male burrowed in the bottom who had probably snapped up that moon pie in 6 furious bites. But it was only a partial victory for him. With the weight of the whole colony upon him, that sucker had to be hurting, with complications from asphyxiation and sucrose shock. I circled the colony a few times to see what happened next. After a while, the prairie dogs just got tired of being on top of each other, and they gradually slid off the pile, staggered home to their craters. I felt sorry for the ones on the bottom. It was obvious that they had been squished. After the others left, the critters from the bottom just lay there for a while, shell-shocked and listless under the hot sun. and then they started scratching off their bellies. I prayed for their survival. There were a lot of heavy-duty vultures and hawks circling around those colonies all the time, and if one of those flattened critters dawdled getting back to his hole, he would be somebody's dinner before long. I kept the plane well stocked on pastries after that, and this was one of the great pleasures of our coast-to-coast flight, feeding the prairie dogs. If an airport didn't have a vending machine with moon pies, I bought donuts or peanut butter crackers. We could even throw out a bag of potato chips, unopened, and the prairie dogs would tear through the wrapping paper and greedily consume the potato chips in a matter of seconds. Those little boogers were really starving down there. The big scrummage over the moon pie wasn't fair to the animals on the bottom, so I started altering my technique to protect lives. Instead of releasing one solitary moon pie or cracker, I threw out a bunch at high speed, so the baked goods were dispersed over a wide area by our slipstream. It was a lot better that way because then only 10 or 12 critters jumped into a single pile and nobody got hurt. So I thought that was pretty entertaining when I was reading this. There's another part in the book where the boys take their plane and play chicken with a Greyhound bus, and the Greyhound bus actually ends up driving off the side of the road.